Evening, everyone. We'll just wait for a few more minutes to let everybody join. But I'm glad that everybody's joined us tonight. Okay, we'll get started and then we can be admitting people as we start. So good evening, everyone. I'm Hannah and I'm the Head of Learning at Holocaust Centre North. This event is co-hosted by both Holocaust Centre North and the University of Huddersfield Centre for History, Culture and Memory. And what a great turnout to say it's a very cold evening in Britain tonight. So I'm glad to see so many of you are here. Tonight I'm joined by our host for the evening, Professor Jodie Matthews, and our speaker, Catharine Aretakis, who will be introduced very shortly. A few technical things to mention. I will be monitoring the chat box, so if you have any questions or any issues, please put them there and I will do what I can. The talk should last around 45 minutes with 15 minutes at the end for discussion and questions, and we will be finishing around 6 p.m. Tonight's event is recorded and tomorrow you'll receive a link for the recording and a short online survey. So any feedback you can give would be most appreciated. As I said, our host this evening is Professor Jodie Matthews. Jodie is Professor of Literature and Acting Head of Department for Communications and Humanities. She's also an expert in their representations and experiences of those who travel around Britain, including the Romani, so she's the perfect host for tonight's event. Thank you for hosting, Jodie, and I will now hand over to you.
Thank you. Thanks very much. It was a very quick yes from me when I was asked to be involved tonight because the talk sounded absolutely fascinating, really closely related to my research, but also to the teaching that I do on our own Masters in Holocaust and Genocide Studies here at Huddersfield. Catharine Aretakis has recently accepted a PhD position at Utrecht University in the Netherlands, which starts in February. So we wish her all the best with that. She's a recent graduate of the MA in Holocaust and Genocide Studies at the University of Amsterdam, which operates in collaboration with the Netherlands Institute for War, Holocaust and Genocide Studies. She has a BA in History and Literature with a minor in Jewish Studies from the University of South Carolina Honors College. If you want to give her a follow on Instagram, you can see how to spell her surname there. So it's K Aretakis. And so she's going to speak for about 45 minutes and then we'll have questions. So I really look forward to this, and over to you, Catharine.
Okay, great. So first, I want to thank you all for joining the lecture. I'm really excited to be presenting to everyone on such an important and also little known topic as part of such an important lecture series. So I also want to thank the University of Huddersfield Centre for History, Culture and Memory and the Holocaust Centre North for inviting me here and also for hosting this series. I think it's important to note that the week in which I'm giving this lecture was chosen intentionally to commemorate the date 80 years ago when Heinrich Himmler issued the now infamous Auschwitz Decree, which ordered that all Romani mixed bloods, Romani and non-German blooded members of Romani clans should be brought to the Auschwitz concentration camp. The original source material uses what Roma people can consider to be a racial slur. For the entirety of the lecture, I'm not going to be using the language, even when directly quoting from the source material. I'll try to make it really clear when I've made these substitutions, but it's safe to assume anything that is quite old that I'm quoting from, I've likely made a substitution to the original language. So the following lecture is divided into 3 separate sections. The first details the persecution of the Roma and Sinti across Europe before Nazism and before the start of the Second World War. Due to natural limitations, the section will not address every country in Europe, but it will attempt to touch on and give a general overview of each region and just the general atmosphere. In the second section, I'm going to discuss how when the Nazis came to power, they enabled the pre-existing desires of many European countries to rid their societies of the Roma and Sinti living within their borders. This section deals specifically with the relationship between the Nazis and the local governments across Europe, and how this relationship impacted the eventual fate of the victims in each country. This section deals specifically with case studies in Croatia, Germany, France, Italy, and Czech Republic, formerly known as the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia. And in the third and final section, I will address the memory of the Romani genocide and how it differs from the memory of other victim groups, but primarily of the Jews. In this section, I'm going to examine the memory culture of the Romani ethnic group, as well as a persisting hatred against the Roma and Sinti in present-day Europe, and how that hatred contributes to the differences. The overall intention of the lecture is to see the genocide of the Roma and Sinti not as the sole result of Nazism and of Hitler's murderous regime, but rather as the result of a centuries-long process of racial discrimination and persecution across Europe, and that these beliefs continue to shape the cultural memory of the genocide of the Roma and Sinti, which was carried out during the Holocaust. So keep that objective in mind as we go through the lecture, but now that I've given a bit of a roadmap, I will begin. So the persecution, oh, it went too fast. The persecution of the Roma and Sinti across Europe before the Second World War. In order to discuss the persecution before the rise of Nazism in the 1930s, I have to provide first a brief overview of the origins of Romani culture in Europe. The Romani are an Indo-Aryan ethnic group that originated in northern India and migrated in the first few hundred years CE until they eventually entered Europe through the Balkans during the Byzantine Empire around 800 CE. And as you can see in this map, kind of between 800 and 1050 CE, the Roma had spread all across Europe and had become a feature in nearly every country across the whole continent. The Romani ethnic group are culturally nomadic, and this is also well documented from the very start of their entrance into Europe. Also from the very start, the Roma faced the ire of the European population, which we'll discuss that it still lasts into the present day, especially that of the political classes. The first documented case of anti-Roma persecution is actually in the year 969 CE, when the Patriarch of Antioch, under the rule of Emperor John I, expelled the Roma living in Antioch to a city in what is now southern Bulgaria. An expulsion very quickly became a very normal part of life for the Roma and Sinti living in Europe. Indeed, as just a sampling of instances of Roma expulsion, there is proof that Romanis were ordered expelled from no less than 8 European countries just between the years of 1416 and 1536. In 1510, any Romani that was found in Switzerland was ordered to be executed, which was de facto expulsion order with very large consequences. And in 1554, a statute was passed in England that mandated all Romani leave the country or face execution. Similar legislation was passed in numerous European nations, including Denmark in 1589 and Sweden in 1637. Portugal, on the other hand, also began deportations of Romanis to its colonies in 1538. In addition to these many expulsions, Romani were also enslaved in the region of Romania for centuries, from at least 1340 until the abolition of Roma slavery in the region in 1856. Romani men, women, and children were also frequently murdered by non-Romas, but these crimes went unpunished by the state as they were not considered citizens of these countries. Now, you might be wondering why it was that from the very beginning of the Roma's entrance into Europe, they faced such unrelenting persecution across the entire continent. There are 2 primary reasons for that. The first is pure and simple racism, as we would call it. The Roma, having migrated from northern India, did not have white skin, or at least as white as that of your average European. The Europeans noted this almost immediately, and condemnations of the Romani, which make explicit reference to their skin color, can be also found from the very early years of their time in Europe. You can take, for instance, a letter penned by a Franciscan traveler in 1350, which describes the Roma as having skin of a very dirty black color. The Roma were seen as a dirty and criminally deviant group, with accounts as early as 1323 describing how the place inhabited by them became, after the term of 30 days, so full of vermin and other filth that it is impossible to live in their neighborhood. I'm going to explain in a moment why these attributions of filth and criminality can still constitute traditional racism, even though it is not directly related to skin color. In addition to skin color, the nomadic lifestyle of the Roma often provoked discomfort and hatred on the part of the populace and of government officials. The primary reason for this comes from the way that we structure society and traditional structures of governance. The traditional European government structure relies on sedentary lifestyles in order to maintain control over the population and also security over borders. Methods of this control include stuff like census taking and tax collection. It's very hard to do that with a nomadic group of people. Dr. Heather Alexander, an expert on nationality, statelessness, and refugee law, describes the phenomenon in the following way. Nomadism was seen as undesirable by both colonial and post-colonial governments because this lifestyle was considered antithetical to state sovereignty, challenged the idea of a unified nation, and weakened the sense of fixed state borders. As promised, I want to return to my discussion of how traditional racism encompasses more than just physical differences. It comes down to what scholars call racialization, and I put the definition on the PowerPoint here. Racialization refers to the process through which differences between people are ascribed to racial identity. This is to say that race becomes an all-encompassing concept that can be used to describe any and all differences between two or more groups of people. These differences are then essentialized to every member of the group, and the group itself becomes a monolithic stereotype created by the rest of society. Simply being a Romani meant that one was automatically considered a habitual criminal, dirty, unintelligent, etc. All of these traits were considered antisocial or asocial, and the belief that these traits were present in all members of the Roma ethnic group is known as hereditary asociality, meaning that this asociality is passed through genetic traits. We can, of course, also see how these beliefs in asociality dovetail with the belief that traditional Roma lifestyles did not fit into traditional European nation-state societies, as I was speaking about earlier. These racial politics were the essential foundation for the remaking of Europe into a fully racialized state before the Second World War. The centrality of race to European modernity also arises from the fact that the construction of these racial categories serve as a way to maintain physical boundaries between groups that are subjects of state power. Systems of state power, access to these institutions, and the discourse surrounding racial categories both strengthen the existence and separation of these groups. As sociologist Agnes Bancroft explains, they have the particular utility of providing a common sense, theoretical, and practical way of dealing with the tensions which characterize modernity. The complete racialization of the state also assured the concept of race acted as a salient feature of all levels of life and government up to and including exclusionary practices before the Second World War. In the common cultural conception, therefore, the Roma and Sinti constituted a distinct racial group that the racialized state could indiscriminately marginalize both socially and economically, which historian Sybil Milton explains helped to facilitate their persecution and provide the rationale for their exclusion, concentration, and annihilation. We can see the impacts of this racialization on the persecution of the Roma and Sinti across Europe in the years immediately before the war and also immediately after the start of the war. The racialization of the Roma and Sinti in what would later become the Greater German Reich well preceded the founding of the Nazi Party. As early as 1905, debates in Bavaria about the plague of the Romani, and I'll use the quotes there, centered on the inherent criminality of the group and aimed at creating a genealogical register of the Roma and Sinti across the state. As historian Carol Fings points out, the cornerstone of the Roma policy later taken over by the Nazi regime came from these laws in Bavaria. The racial character of the persecution there is very telling of its prevalence outside of Nazism, given that they came from 1905. In these cases, the racialization was mostly centered on a long-held desire to isolate the Roma and Sinti from the German population. The desire resulted primarily from the belief that German culture and Romani culture were inherently incompatible. This is to say, the mere existence of Roma and Sinti stood in constant conflict to the concept of Germanness, And this is a really radical form of racialization because it removes even forced assimilation as an option and necessitates ethnic cleansing as the only solution. As historians Donald Kenrick and Gretchen Puxson stated, when the Nazi Party came to power in 1933, they actually inherited anti-Roma laws already in operation and did not have to do much to create their own. The first Nazi legislation regarding Roma and Sinti was therefore a continuation of expulsion and sedentarization policies from the different states, such as those from Bavaria. In fact, on March 18th, 1933, which is the very first month of the Nazi regime, government representatives from the different regions in Germany held a convention to address the Roma scourge, where they consolidated all of the pre-existing legislation and extended their provisions to the whole of the German Reich. Not only in Germany was anti-Ziganist, which means anti-Roma, legislation implemented nearly immediately after the rise of a fascist regime. In Croatia, anti-Ziganism was so essential to Ustaša ideology that only 9 days after its founding, the Pavelić regime passed legislation removing the Roma and Sinti from the national community. The immediate adoption of these laws and the targeting of the Roma and Sinti also point to a continuation of ideology from before the advent of fascism in Croatia and grounded in existing cultural ideologies. Primary historical trend contributing to the racialization and subsequent mass murder of the Roma and Sinti in Croatia was the intensely hostile inter-ethnic state, resulting from over a decade of intense competition for political power between the different ethnic groups, Serbs, Croats, Slovenes in the region who were unable and unwilling to coexist. In the hands of the Ustaša, these strained ethnic relationships were exacerbated and utilized to legitimize mass extermination for groups deemed inimical to the Croatians. Jews and Roma were viewed as agents of the Serbs in Croatia, and the Serbs were considered the primary antagonists of the Croat state. So although Pavelić's Croatia acted as a puppet state to the Third Reich, the persecution against Roma and Sinti there was answered by indigenous forces using native frameworks of racialization, which were actually focused on purging Croatia of all non-Croats and had a very different legitimization than what we see in Nazi Germany. Accordingly, the racial segregation of the Roma from Croat society became a primary ambition of Croatian racial theorists who advocated its benefits in terms of controlling the Romani population, but also exploiting their labor. These actions, which were finally undertaken during the Second World War, were legitimized in the racial othering of the Croatian Romani, resulting mainly from these ethnic hostilities, which I was speaking about. The Italian government also took the first step towards ethnic cleansing and the internment of the Roma and Sinti as early as 1926. The timeline of these policies also illustrate that the measures taken against them were entirely founded in Italian ideologies and for the most part were carried out apart from the Nazi pursuance of these same goals. Over the centuries, the central and regional policies targeting Roma and characterizing them as inherently deviant criminals acted, as sociologist Nando Sigona described, a nodal point of intersection of ideologies, practices, power, and processes of contestation and accommodation. At this nodal point is where you can precisely locate the Italian nature of the threads of racialization which underlie the persecution in that country, which began in the Middle Ages, went through to the Holocaust, and still continues into the present day. One of these threads revolves around the belief that all the Romani in Italy were necessarily foreigners, no matter how long they had lived in Italy or if they had been born in the country. This view was particularly influential in the radicalization of the persecution during the war, when there was a significant influx of refugees fleeing other regimes imposing harsh treatment on the Romani in their own territories. As a result, persecutory measures against Roma and Sinti, regardless of their citizenship status, intensified. In Bohemia, especially after the annexation of Austria and the Sudetenland, one such refugee influx also caused a great panic among Czech officials who termed it also a Roma plague. And this is language that you'll hear again and again. In response, the Czech Interior Ministry, following the guidelines of their 1927 decree regulating the movement of the Romani, ordered their forced resettlement in November of 1939 and their internment as early as January of 1940. Further waves of refugees only reinforced existing notions of otherness in Italy and Bohemia and served as the primary legitimization for creating all of the anti-Ziganist legislation in these countries, both before and during the Second World War. The persecution of Romani also has a long history in French culture and legislation. Beginning as early as 1539, the Roma and Sinti in France were subject to legislation which centered on fears surrounding their physical and linguistic differences and aversion to established society. The legal persecution of the French Romani only radicalized from this first point to the point where, as historian Denis Pichensky points out, the denunciation of the Roma plague, there it is again, had become the antiphon of the administrators of the public order. The view of Roma and Sinti as perpetual foreigners outside of the national community, which we saw was so instrumental to the persecution policies in Bohemia and Italy, was also prevalent in France. Again, this belief was not necessarily grounded in any state of reality, but rather emanated from the French belief regarding the Romani that predated both Nazism and Vichyism. One example of the specific racial character of the persecution in France is an article from Le Petit Parisien in 1908, which described the Roma and Sinti as harmful people and suggested that the French crack down on these presumptuous parasites, these rodents which infect their territory. It is therefore unsurprising that when the Vichy regime, which is an independent authoritarian ally of Nazi Germany characterized by intense nationalism, came to power, that they positioned the importance of ethnic identity over their claims to French citizenship. Much as in Germany, the actions taken against the Romani during the war were also founded on an enduring desire to keep the Roma away from French society. This desire led to a considerably indifferent attitude towards government policies persecuting the Romani on the part of the French populace and an active attempt to segregate the Romani on the part of the French authorities. One such policy is the house arrest order, which was initiated prior to the Nazi occupation in 1940 and was a precursor to the internment policies which were enacted during the occupation. The results of these views, in combination with many others regarding their criminality, poverty, etc., led to the constant marginalization of the Romani as a racialized other in French society over the centuries. With this understanding of the state of anti-Roma legislation and sentiment prior to and immediately after the start of the war, I want to move on to the next section, which details how the Nazis built on and enabled the pre-existing desires of these countries to cleanse their societies of the Romani. So we will then talk about the persecution during the war. So the significant role played by local forces across Europe in the persecution of the Roma and Sinti was both a cause and a symptom of extensive decentralized radicalization that was really dependent on pre-existing prejudices in each of these countries. In each country, local and native policies and initiatives played a significant role in aggravating and accelerating the persecution of the Roma and Sinti. This is because, for the most part, although Nazi leadership and occupation impacted the anti-Ziganist policies in some areas, local politics and persecution prior to the war actually had the biggest effect on what occurred during the war, especially whether or not the wartime persecution would culminate in mass murder. Outside of the Nazi system, in places like Italy and Croatia, the importance of native dynamics to the radicalization of the persecution remains evident, and even countries under National Socialist occupation didn't radicalize to the same extent, which is a further indication of, how important these local policies were to what happened in the end. The primary explanation for these differences also lies in the pre-existing cultural beliefs that influenced the local and native forces who were deemed responsible for carrying out the persecution of the group. In Nazi-occupied countries such as France and the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, Nazi involvement in the persecution ceased after they enacted an initial order requiring Romani to be interned. After this, the development of the persecution was left entirely to local officials. The relationship between central and local policies thus was one evolving primarily within the borders of each country, but was of course nevertheless influenced by the events shaping the rest of the continent. For the purpose of this lecture only, we're going to consider Germany to be a Nazi-occupied country, insofar as that local German officials acted on a scope much more similar to local officials in other countries, when it came to the persecution of the Roma and Sinti. Collaborationist regimes such as Vichy France and Mussolini's Italy are also going to show us the impact of pre-war attitudes on the development of persecution during the war, because Nazism was not exerting any extra political influence, so to say, on the actions of these regimes, pursuant to the persecution of the Roma and Sinti, of course. In any case, in the context of the Second World War, the relationship between central and local policies based on long-held prejudices and also ambitions for societal marginalization and exclusion was critical to the acceleration of persecution towards mass murder. I'm going to put a map up so that you can see a rough estimate of the Romani population in Europe, circa 1939. The radicalization of anti-Ziganist policy across Europe, as I said, relied on these local forces who already had a vested interest in the marginalization of the Roma in countries that had racialized them for centuries and thus already had deeply embedded racist discourses and practices. And these were not, grafted onto these countries by the Nazis. They were already indigenous to these populations. The legitimization given to local desires by fascist regimes intent on the deportation and physical destruction of the group furthered this radicalization. And the result of this relationship can be seen in each of the 5 countries that I discussed in the last section. So in Germany, we can see that local police forces worked on their own initiative to set up internment camps for Romani outside of most major cities, and also to advocate for their deportation to the ghettos and camps in the east as soon as it was an option. In fact, in many cases, these local officials were far more eager than the central powers in Berlin, who were more intently focused on either the war or on the deportation of the German Jews. In these cases, local officials found their plans for the extermination of the Romani actually slowed down by Nazi leaders in Berlin. Of course, that's not to say that central officials in Nazi Germany did not want the deportation and extermination to happen eventually. It merely meant that they gave primary importance to solving what we know as the Jewish question. A secondary reason for this is that local officials were often given responsibility for the persecution of the Roma and Sinti. This led in some cases to extreme eagerness to execute these orders, as we can see above the German officials. And in others, as we see in occupied France, it led to the delay and prevention of deportation in favor of other forms of persecution, such as internment or forced assimilation in labor camps. In France, there was a much stronger cultural tie to forced assimilation, which was a holdover from the popular Republican ideals which were fomented in the late 1700s. And there was a hesitance, actually, among local officials who were left to deal with the persecution alone to request the deportation of the Romani as their German counterparts had done. They did, however, eagerly accept the offer to intern the Roma in camps and remove them from French society. A very apt example of the primary role played by French officials in the persecution is actually the fact that the camps, which were set up to intern the Roma, continued after liberation and the end of the war, and the last one closed towards the end of 1946. This points obviously to the complicity and the active involvement of the French forces in the persecution of the Roma and Sinti during the war. In Italy, we see the same tendency towards internment over deportation that we saw in France, which is interesting because it keeps with and departs from, in some ways, the policy towards Italian Jews during the war. The one aspect of similarity is primarily that the persecution suffered by all racial minorities in Italy was far less than was the case in Nazi Germany. The difference being that Italian Jews were actually never interned, while Italian Roma were subject to internment under incredibly harsh conditions from 1938. And when I mentioned 1926 earlier, that was when they had begun ethnic cleansing and deporting and expelling people from the border regions. When the German invasion happened in September of 1943, the Roma and Sinti in northern Italy were deported to the concentration and death camps in the east, and those in the south were finally freed. So though the Italian fascists refused to arrest and deport their Jewish population, their long history of anti-Roma sentiment and discrimination made them eager to pursue the arrest and internment of the Romani population. And it's something we see a lot in war times, that the Romani are often locked up because nomadic groups are seen as, dangerous to border control, which is especially important in times of war. The ability of local officials to control the persecution of the Roma and Sinti led to a really different result in Croatia and the Czech Republic, however, than what we see in France and in Italy. In the Czech Republic, local authorities worked very diligently to arrest and intern the Roma population in 2 concentration camps at Ledi and Hodonin. These camps, though originally created as work camps to house prisoners and other asocials, were repurposed to intern only Roma and Sinti. All those who ran and staffed the 2 concentration camps were Czech policemen, whom central administrators had recruited to serve as guards of the camps. Survivors of these camps recount the brutal horror of the Czech guards, their insistence that they would kill all the Roma, and also the torture and murder they were subjected to on a daily basis. Interestingly, some survivors of both Ledi and Auschwitz actually recall Ledi as the worst experience due to the pure brutality of the Czech regime towards the Roma. According to a former director of the Protectorate labor discipline camps, the Germans never got involved in these internal camps, and by their bosses in Prague at the Ministry of the Interior, they were ordered to starve and beat the Roma within a breath of death. Primary role given to local officials in the Czech Republic, therefore worked to the detriment of the Romani population, and shows how the Nazi takeover enabled the Czech authorities to carry out their pre-existing desires to rid the country of Roma and Sinti. In Croatia, we see perhaps the most radical example of this. Croatia also acts as an interesting foil to Italy and also to Vichy France, as they were all collaborator states operating under the influence of, but ultimately separately from, Nazi Germany. After the war in Croatia, only 1% of Romani survived the Second World War. Genocide of the Croatian Romani proceeded without any German insistence and was planned from the very top, systematically and totally. Romani were murdered both in the Jasenovac concentration camp as well as by roaming militias. Outside of the centrally planned extermination in the camp, these Ustaša militiamen murdered any Roma, or in fact other ethnic minorities they came across, and sought out others to kill. The actions of these men were so extreme that, as Kenrick and Puxon describe, the frequent Ustaša murder orgies even appalled the German and Italian military authorities, and on occasion they protested, intervened, and sometimes took over temporary control from the Croat fascists. The immensely gratuitous violence of these men points to, again, a pre-existing hatred that found legal expression through the newly enacted legislation at the central level. The abuse and extermination of prisoners in the Jasenovac camp further illustrate this violence. For lack of time, I won't be able to include every example of the collaboration between native forces and the Nazis during the war. But suffice it to say that when one examines the history of anti-Roma sentiment and persecution in Europe, the story is one of continuity and not of disruption. Genocide of the Roma and Sinti, which the Nazis and Nazism as a whole certainly enabled and played a large role in enacting, was not unpopular across Europe, and was indeed the result of a vast continental hatred of the group. This hatred, which I described in the last segment, led to a near universal desire to remove the Roma from European society, the execution of which pivoted from expulsion to extermination, once the systematic mass murder developed by the Nazis offered an alternative and more permanent end to the Romani's presence in Europe. The result of this pivot is as follows, and I've put a chart here which shows the countries as well as the Roma population, or estimated Roma population, and then 2 different estimates of the number of victims killed. Between 500,000 and 1.5 million Roma men, women, and children were murdered across Europe during the Second World War. The destruction in some countries, as you see here, like the Netherlands, Yugoslavia, Belgium, Lithuania, Poland, and many others, was total. In others, such as Italy or France, though Romani died in concentration camps, they were not systematically exterminated. This disparity points back to the fact that local officials often had near total control over the execution of the persecution of the Roma and Sinti. One thing is certain, the Roma were not spared in any country in Europe. In fact, like the Jews, they were also sought out and murdered by the Einsatzgruppen in Eastern Europe. One final example of the thoroughness of the persecution of the Roma and Sinti is the presence of Roma in nearly every single concentration, work, or extermination camp in all of Europe during the war. There was a Roma camp in Auschwitz, a Roma section of the Lodz ghetto, the list goes on. And you might be thinking, if there was such an overwhelming and complete presence of the Romani in the atmosphere of the Holocaust, why is it that the genocide is still so under-recognized? This precise question is going to lead us to the final section of how the memory of the Roma differs from that of other victims, primarily the Jews. I want to first start with this infamous photo, which I think exemplifies exactly the differences between the memory of the Roma genocide and the Holocaust. If anyone is unaware of or has not seen this photo, suffice to say it's a very iconic Holocaust image. It comes originally from a short movie fragment shot by a Jewish deportee in Westerbork in the Netherlands, as a train full of deportees began the journey to Auschwitz. Immediately after the war, the image of this scared girl was used in numerous documentaries, books, exhibits, etc., quickly became a representation of the fear and the inhumanity of the rail deportations and also of the Holocaust itself. From 1944, it was assumed that the girl was a Dutch Jew. Only in 1994, 50 years later, was the videographer, himself an Auschwitz survivor, able to identify the girl in the photo as Sedele Steinbach, a Dutch Roma girl. This vignette is specifically characteristic of the lack of memory of the total annihilation of the Roma in the Netherlands, as well as across the rest of Europe, which is the result of both denial and ignorance. How do I go back? Yeah. Something else that illustrates these differences is the timeline of remembrance, culture, reparations, memorial building, and more. For instance, while constructions on memorials to the murdered Jews started immediately after 1945, the official memorial to the murdered Roma and Sinti in Berlin, which you can see in this slide here, did not actually open until 2012. The Lety concentration camp in the Czech Republic has been the site of a pig farm since the 1970s, and only in July began to be dismantled by the Czech government, and that's July of 2022. Certainly many sites used for the internment and the execution of the Roma and Sinti have now been lost to time. As a small note, the first act of commemoration for an act of genocide of the Roma and Sinti was indeed a memorial unveiled in 1956 in a very small Polish town, which recognized a massacre of 93 Romani men, women, and children by the Nazis. The reason I don't quote this as the first memorial in the timeline is actually because the Romani in the village had lived alongside the Poles for many, many generations, were really integrated into the local community, and were in fact no longer living as nomadic Romani. So on the memorial stone and in the local consciousness, there's actually no reference to the massacred being ethnically Romani. Instead, they are referred to as locals. There's quite a bit of debate whether this is an indication of their standing within the community or a deliberate choice for political reasons. As we know, the Romani are not treated very kindly in Poland. Even more damning an indictment of the lack of cultural reckoning with the genocide can be seen in the fact that the first German official to acknowledge the genocide was Chancellor Helmut Schmidt in only 1982. Furthermore, the Romani also never received reparations from the German government because it has never officially been considered a racial persecution. That perception of the persecution remains really prevalent across Europe, less so in academic circles, but prevalent nonetheless. The reality is not helped by the lack of remembrance and education about the genocide of the Roma and Sinti. The view is also made really puzzling by the fact that the Nazis never really attempted to hide their belief that the Romani were a distinct racial group of art Fremdesblut, or alien blood. You can take this quote from Nazi physician E. Brandes as a prime example. He says, apart from the Jews, only the Roma come into consideration in Europe as members of an alien people. This belief was certainly not unique to Dr. Brandes, nor to Nazi Germany. It was endemic to European society and expressed itself across the continent in all the ways I discussed in the section on racialization. That this aspect of the genocide remains unrecognized and untaught contributes even further to the gulf between the remembrance of the genocide of Europe's Jews and Europe's Roma. Roma scholars such as Nico Fortuna and Ian Hancock attribute these differences partially to a lack of collective memory among the Roma compared to the Jews. The continued discrimination against the Roma and Sinti in modern-day Europe adds another layer to this and makes the events of the past seem ongoing rather than something to remember, which is partly what contributes to this lack of memory culture among the group, as I've said. I have included here a chart which shows the percentage of the population in European countries that hold unfavorable views of the Roma. As you can see at the top, this study was done in 2019. This chart obviously doesn't show every European country, but I believe it provides a really good insight into the continued hatred of the group across Europe. In places like Italy, where an incredibly high percentage of the population harbors unfavorable views of the Roma, we also see continued systemic discrimination. Italy boasts a number of camps for Roma and Sinti throughout the country that residents have described as ethnic ghettos. As of 2019, 40,000 men, women, and children were living in these camps and are subject to anthropological census-taking measures by the Italian government. Survivors of the genocide still living in Italy are incredibly wary of these census-taking measures, given their experiences in the 1930s and 40s, as well as the fascist leanings of Italy's new leadership. And she has also been quite outspoken about her views on the Roma. One other alarming aspect of this systemic discrimination is the segregation of Roma and non-Roma children in schools across the continent. This discrimination takes a few forms. The first is that Romani children are sent to all Romani schools because they reside in de facto ethnic ghettos, or are segregated into all Romani classes at mixed public schools, both of which offer inferior instruction and often infrastructure. Other Romani children are sent to schools for children with learning disabilities or behavioral problems, merely on account of their being Roma. The institutional rhetoric that backs these choices is nearly identical to the anti-Roma rhetoric touted by the Nazis and other European governments during the genocide. We can also see the effects of the inherent asociality and criminality rhetoric persist into the modern day. For example, though Roma make up only 2 to 3% of the Czech population, a statistic no doubt heavily influenced by the genocide of the 1940s, they constitute 60% of the incarcerated people in the Czech Republic and are arrested and charged at far higher rates than other ethnic groups. In addition to this systemic discrimination, outbreaks of targeted abuse, discrimination, and murder against the group is common throughout Europe. Franz Fuchs's bomb attack that killed 4 Romani in Austria is perhaps one of the more infamous examples of these attacks, though they continue to happen across the continent. You can take, for instance, the 2008 pogroms in Naples, Italy, the 2019 pogroms against the Roma community in Gabravo, Bulgaria, the deportation of 50,000 Romani from Germany to Kosovo by the German government after 2005, or the murder of a Romani family in Hungary in 2019. The number of cases I can list here is frankly inexhaustible. This is, of course, all of this last section is not at all to downplay the persistence of anti-Semitism after the Holocaust, the prevalence of Holocaust denial, or the rising anti-Semitism in today's society. It's merely to point out that comparatively, the memory of the genocide of European Jewry is exponentially more recognized than the genocide of the European Roma and Sinti, and that there are inevitable after effects of this disparity. The genocide of the Roma and Sinti and its causes have not yet been grappled with really in the popular society, and even to some extent in the academic society. The result is this sort of paradox, which has greatly impacted the memory of the genocide in society. That is, that the genocide itself is condemned, while the fundamental beliefs that caused it are not grappled with. So when we discuss the more surface level causes of the genocide of the Jews, such as blood libel, the Elders of Zion conspiracy, the list goes on, many of us can quickly recognize these as blatant racist conspiracies unfounded in reality. By we, I of course exclude neo-Nazis, other denialists. As I said, I'm really well aware that these conspiracy theories remain alive and well in society. However, it is undeniable that after the Holocaust, anti-Semitism has been reckoned with to a much higher degree than anti-Zionism. There are still miles and miles to go, but we can see these differences. As opposed to what I said moments ago about the recognized absurdity of some of the anti-Semitic conspiracies that fueled the Holocaust, the stereotypes about the Roma, that they are dirty, criminal, unintelligent, etc., were and still are deemed true by a large majority of the European population, as we can see by this chart. In fact, a 2015 study by the European Commission actually declared the Roma to be the most discriminated against minority group in Europe. We can see clearly that the memory of the genocide of the Roma and Sinti has not done very much to address the sentiments that caused it. A perhaps more shocking example is this bit from a Netflix comedy special by Jimmy Carr that was released on Christmas Day just last year. I'm going to try to play it for you quickly now. It's only a few seconds.
We don't have the sound, I'm afraid.
Oh, sorry. Well, I'm not quite sure how to fix that.
I guess it's because the audio is coming through your microphone. So.
Oh, wait, I think I've got it.
Right, this should be a career ender. Okay, strap in everyone, you ready? When people talk about the Holocaust, when people talk about the Holocaust, they talk about the tragedy and horror of 6 million Jewish lives being lost to the Nazi war machine. But they never mention the thousands of gypsies that were killed by the Nazis. No one ever wants to talk about that because no one ever wants to talk about the positives. That's a very good job.
Now, I'll mention again that this is just last year. You know, it's really quite recent, and this was released on Netflix. You didn't have to go anywhere special to find this. So obviously, this is a deeply disturbing clip, but the message and the laughter that follow are something that I feel are really necessary to view when trying to see how the same beliefs that have been utilized to persecute the Romani for centuries, that led to the genocide during the Second World War, go forth in society largely unchallenged by academics, by the government, and also by non-Romani citizens. And it is precisely the persistence of these sentiments that make discussions like the one we're having today so very important. So thank you for having me here to speak on this topic, and I would love to open the floor to questions.
Thank you so much, Catherine. Really a rigorously researched and important talk. If anybody does have questions, perhaps they could pop those in the chat. Might be the easiest way. I don't know whether I will catch everybody if they put their hands up. That is another option. But if you can pop questions in the chat, that would be great. I'm going to take chair's privilege and ask the first question while people are thinking about this. One thing that I find really interesting is a deliberate move to change some of this narrative via the Romani Resistance Day, or Day of Romani Resistance, 16th of May 1944, and the Romani Uprising. And I just wondered if you could speak a little bit to how in the memorialization of the Paramos, the importance of acts of resistance within that.
Yeah, it is a bit challenging because of what I said about this kind of lack of memory culture. There are a lot of, you know, Romani activists who are doing just such incredible work. I recently saw a documentary film about it was made by a Roma woman about her great-grandfather who was actually in the resistance. And just this kind of, the narrative is taking hold that, and we're kind of, you just see that it's years and years behind what we saw with the discussion about the Jews. You know, first it was sheep to the slaughter, and then it became, you know, living was an act of resistance. And we're starting to see it now with the Roma community as well, that we're kind of, that they're catching up to this. It's kind of saying, okay, it's not anymore just, we're going to forget about it because it was horrible and we can't speak about it. And then in a sense, we've now come to this, now there is a lot of proof about this kind of uprising during the liquidation of the Auschwitz Roma camp, and these sorts of commemorations, which I think is a really wonderful trajectory that the memory culture is taking.
Thank you. We have another question from Laura in the chat. How did World War II shape the migration patterns of the surviving Roma post-war?
Oh, that is such a great question. Unfortunately, it is outside of my area of expertise. Once we kind of, all of the research that I did for this presentation after the end of the war didn't really go into the migration patterns. A lot of the Roma in Western Europe were actually already sedentary before the war happened. And it's kind of these persisting cultural narratives that really make it seem as though they are still, nomadic people. I wouldn't say that it necessarily had a huge impact overall, not in the way that you see this kind of Jewish diaspora of everyone leaving Europe, and I don't think you see the same in the Romani community, but I wouldn't be able to answer with 100% certainty.
I guess the other part of that is in some of the states that you were talking about, communist regimes that had a huge impact on patterns of movement and one's ability to move as well. There is another more of a comment in the chat that I'm going to reframe slightly as part of our discussion. About the fact that Jimmy Carr is deliberately a shock comedian, and the place of those deliberately transgressive comments, and whether there is any place for the kind of deliberately transgressive anti-Ziganism. You could possibly tell by my tone that I completely disagree, but I will, it has been posted in the chat, and I'll give you the opportunity to respond to that one.
Yeah, it's definitely not the first piece I've heard from him. I tend to disagree with shock comedy as a genre, in a sense, when you're kind of, what they talk about is whether you're punching up or punching down. And at the end of the day, it's completely inappropriate. And despite the fact that this was released on Netflix to a wide audience who lacks a lot of this context, and actually who probably lack any context about the persecution of the group in Europe, the most shocking thing that I find about it is actually the laughter. You can tell that the people aren't shocked. They find it funny and they think that it's true. And yeah, I don't really think it has any place in popular culture at all. I think it's entirely inappropriate, regardless of the context of his work.
Thank you so much for that considered response. Nikki's asked if there's any reading you would recommend to follow up from the session. Obviously, you mentioned Kenrick and Puxon's work. Is there ones in particular you'd like to recommend?
Oh, off the top of my head, that's difficult. Would it be possible to include a reading list in the email that we send out to everyone tomorrow? Because maybe then I could come up with quite a list for everyone.
Yeah, absolutely, Catherine.
Okay, great.
We're trying to get through as many of these as we can. Brian's question takes us in a slightly different direction that I just wanted to follow up, which was how the UK responded to the persecution of Roma and Sinti during the war within the UK and what was happening in Europe.
I don't know so much about the UK. It was outside of the scope of my research, so I can't answer that question specifically. However, I can provide an interesting fun fact, or I guess not a fun fact, but an interesting fact is actually that Hitler had lists drawn up of the population of the Roma in the UK for when he eventually planned to, invade and take over the UK, because he was also planning to annihilate, the Roma population there. So I don't know really how the government itself reacted to the persecution. I know the American government didn't really react at all. I can imagine the British government was likely the same, but I can't say for sure.
We do have a question about some of the terminology. You prefaced the talk by referring to the fact that you'd be exchanging what some people call the G word with other terms. There is a lot of debate in this country, and some people do claim that word as one that they would self-ascribe to. Steve has asked whether anti-Ziganism is still an acceptable term, given that it includes a term used across Europe that is widely considered racist.
Yeah, it's interesting. I have not heard anybody have issues with it, which is not to say that people don't have issues with it and that they're not valid. I just haven't come across them. The reason I was using it was because it was in all of the most recent scholarship. And so a lot more of the sociological scholarship. When I was speaking with some other Roma activists and scholars, that was the term that they were using. Of course, it's not to say that I can, of course, see why there would be issues with it, considering it does include, of course, the descriptor from the German word for the Roma and Sinti. So I will have to look into that, because I haven't really heard any debate about the use of the term, but it's a good thing to look into for sure.
Yeah, I think it's safe to say it's a really complex question, and it's ongoing, and it is pretty regionally specific as well, and community specific as well. But I think, we can all agree that there's been a lot of care and attention taken towards the use of language today, which is, part of these questions. Just cutting back to Owen's question, he wondered if you could comment on perhaps some of the factors about the ongoing exclusion of Roma and Sinti in Europe. Yeah,
absolutely. I really do think it is all coming down to the fact that, like I said, the causes for the discrimination have not been addressed. So we can say, of course, it's bad to go through and persecute people and kill people. We say this was bad, but the reasons why it was happening are true. They are criminals, and so they should be in jail. They are, even when you have conversations with people, sometimes I have conversations with people who are my age about the research that I'm doing, and they go, oh yeah, but they are all criminals. And here's one time that somebody tried to steal from me. And it really goes down to the fact that they will say, of course, it is bad that this happened during the Holocaust. However, the group is still like this, X, X, and Y, and there's this cognitive dissonance in being able to see how the rhetoric, and we'll say an additional thing that factors in is that up until very, very recently, and actually probably still in many circles, the genocide of the Roma and Sinti was considered something that appeared in a vacuum with Nazism. That the Nazis came in, they plucked the Roma out of the countries, they killed them, and then the remaining local forces were kind of left without they didn't have to answer for the fact that a lot of what happened was because they were happy to take part in the persecution and had a lot to do with local prejudices.
Thank you so much. So one last question that we have time for, and it's from Laura, who notes that the Nazis had a particular definition for people being racially Jewish, depending on their heritage, their grandparentage. And Laura asks whether a similar definition was in use for Roma and Sinti.
Yeah, this is actually a really interesting question, because it kind of goes the exact opposite way. Which is to say that the people who are persecuted, and this is also a difficult question, because like I said, the local officials in each country were kind of responsible for what happened there. And we do see that the Nazis were really unable to force their definition on other countries. So this really only applies within Germany, and other countries were left to use their own definitions. But the Nazi definition was basically that anyone who was 100% Romani, had 4 Romani grandparents, was considered a pure, and actually was exempt from the persecution, because they said that the racial mixing was what was causing these kind of asocial characteristics. There's a really fascinating article, which I will put in the reading list, which is called Himmler's Racially Pure Roma. And it talks about the fact that Heinrich Himmler was really obsessed with the idea of Roma culture and this kind of like pure Roma person. So it is a bit weird. It's anyone who had one Roma grandparent, or usually who was living a Roma lifestyle, was subject to persecution, but actually pure Roma were legally allowed to maintain their nomadic lifestyles and were to be left completely alone as almost a protected species by the Nazi government. It's very strange. And
thank you so much. Thank you for all those questions, and to Catherine for your generous responses to them, as well as the talk. So I'd like to thank you once again for that talk and invite everybody else to use in the reactions tab the applause to demonstrate our thank you, or to, as Owen has done, to applaud visually as well. So thank you so much. And at this point, I'm going to hand back over to Hannah.
Yeah, thank you, Catherine, and thank you, Jodie. That was brilliant. So I'm just going to drop a few links into the chat. First of all, we've got our future events that I would love to see you all at. I'm also going to drop the survey that I mentioned. I will put it in the email tomorrow as well, but if anyone can do it now, that would be great. And just finally, the Twitter link to CHICAM, the Centre for History, Culture and Memory, if anyone would like to go and give them a follow. So once again, thank you very much for this evening. Thank you for joining us. And I hope you all have a good evening, whatever you're doing. Thank you.